Christine. Good evening, everyone. I am so excited that this is our kickoff event for the webinars of 2025. Can you believe it? Tonight we have Dr. Christine Stortini, and she is presenting a marine biologist's perspective on the human-ocean connection. At first, I will provide an introduction, and then I will hand the podium over to Christine. My name is Carmen, and I'm the volunteer with the Climate Hub, and I'll be the moderator for tonight's webinar. Please let us begin by respectful acknowledgement that we are in the Robinson-Huron and Robinson Superior Treaty Territories, and that the land on which we are gathered is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, and specifically the Garden River and Batchewana First Nations, as well as the settlement lands of the Métis people. And I thank you for that. So a word about who we are, and we being the Sault Climate Hub, is a citizen-led volunteer organization dedicated to locally advancing climate change mitigation and adaptation through education and engagement. In addition to the webinar series, the Sault Climate Hub produces a quarterly newsletter and sponsors or participates in a variety of in-person events. And just to remind everybody, as it shows on the screen, we are a chapter of the Global Climate Reality Project and the climatereality.ca as well. You can find us on Facebook, on Instagram, and we're under Sault Climate Hub. We can also be emailed at saultclimatehub@gmail.com. And as always, we fully welcome any new volunteers and participants, and you're welcome to participate as much or as little, and there are no membership fees. Our online webinars are held 6 times a year, and typically they fall on the last Wednesday of the month, and we have a 30 to 40 minute presentation followed by a question period. That's the format. Tonight's webinar, as I already said, is the first in our 2025 series. And please note that video recordings of all webinars of the Sault Climate Hub are available on the YouTube channel by the same name. I am pleased to introduce Dr. Christine Stortini. Once she begins to speak, you will immediately know that Christine is driven by her love for the ocean and her belief that a greater understanding of and the empathy for the natural world can eventually bring us to better harmony and protection for our life source, the ocean, as part of the natural world. Christine's talk will flow from an overview of marine biology and oceanography to the more complex topic of the give and take relationship between humans and the ever-changing ocean. She will touch on several ways humans are connected to, rely on, and impact the ocean. She will explain what consequences we can expect from climate change in the ocean and what we, everyday citizens, can do about it. Dr. Christine Stortini is a Sault Ste. Marie-born marine biologist. She grew up between St. Joseph Island and Toronto, and then she moved to Nova Scotia to pursue a career in marine biology. She completed both her Bachelor of Science in 2012 and Master of Environmental Studies 2014 at Dalhousie in Halifax, and her PhD 2020 in Theoretical Marine Ecology at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Christina has worked in the fields of geospatial climate change vulnerability assessment to support conservation planning and fisheries managers, species distribution models to predict climate change-related shifts in commercial species distributions, conservation planning for climate change resilience, data management, science program coordination, and strategic science planning. She has also made several classroom visits and many online public talks. And she even ran her own children's ocean education business between 2020 and 2022. Following this introduction, Christine will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then there will be time for any of us and all of us to ask questions. You can type your questions into the group chat as we go along, or you can save them until the end of the presentation and then raise your hand. And if there are not too many people with raised hands, we can hear from you verbally. At the end of the presentation, I will read out any questions in the chat and invite people with raised hands to ask their questions out loud. So, Christine, welcome. Dr. Stortini, welcome.
Thank you so much, Carmen. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for having me. It is an honor to give this presentation to my hometown after many years being away, and so it's very exciting for me to be able to give this presentation. So I'll share my screen, and we tested this out before, but just if you could just let me confirm that you can see my full screen and nothing is obstructing it.
Everything's good. Looks awesome.
Perfect. So I am giving this presentation from Montreal, and which is home to First Nations, including the Kanien'kehá:ka and of the Haudenosaunee Confederation, Huron, Wendat, Abenaki, and Anishinaabeg First Nations, as well as Mohawk peoples. So I just want to acknowledge that and thank them for their stewardship, continued stewardship of the lands and waters of this area. My presentation today is my own perspective on the human-ocean connection, a little bit about what I do and why I do it, and then also a little bit about what we can all do to help in these trying times. And this image that you're seeing here, I thought was, I asked Bing Image Creator to give me an image of the human heart in connection to nature, specifically to the ocean, and this is what it gave me. And this is sort of in my mind, what this presentation, the core of this presentation is meant to be. Okay, so a bit about me. I went to high school in Toronto. I learned about coral bleaching in one of my high school classes, and I decided that I really wanted to do something about it. Then my mom took me to California as a Christmas gift when I was about 16 years old, and I fell in love with the ocean. And I decided I wanted to move to Halifax to become a marine biologist. So I did. I stayed there for 14 years. I did a Bachelor of Science in Marine Biology with an honors, and I did the co-op program at Dalhousie University. So I got a lot of on-the-ground fieldwork experience as well. I did my master's there, and then I did a PhD out of Halifax, but remotely for Queen's University. While I was there, I developed an even stronger relationship with the ocean. I learned how to surf. I started scuba diving. And as an island girl from St. Joe's Island, I've always felt comfortable in the water. I've always felt most at peace when I'm in it, on it, in proximity to it. And so I still get that feeling on the lake, but also on the ocean. And when I get that smell of salty air, it really makes me feel at home. So since my PhD, I started working for the government again on various projects, including one on freshwater science. So as a marine biologist, that was kind of veering off into a different direction. And I got to learn a whole lot of new stuff and started to have a better understanding of the connectivity of it all. And I'll talk a little bit about that project today in this presentation. I had a brief stint as an entrepreneur. I started an ocean education business in Montreal to bring my love for the ocean to the inland and start teaching children about the ocean and the interconnectivity of aquatic ecosystems. But now I'm back working for the government, and I'm providing directions on climate change science in Fisheries and Oceans Canada to support fisheries and marine conservation and many other of our management type sectors within the department. But just a disclaimer, this presentation comes from me as a marine biologist. It's my personal opinion and not that of Fisheries and Oceans Canada. Okay, so as Carmen introduced, today's presentation will flow from a tiny bit of basics on marine biology and oceanography, just to give context and background. And then I'll discuss a little bit about the give and take of our relationship with the ocean, how we're connected to it, why it's important to us, and how we impact it. And then what we can expect due to climate change and other stressors in the ocean, and how that impacts what humans care about and need. And then what's being done currently by scientists, managers, and people, and what everyday citizens can do to help. So a bit of basics. The ocean covers 71% of the Earth, contains 97% of the Earth's water. Only 5% of it has been explored, which looks somewhat like this, if we look at it spatially. 228,450 species are known, and we expect many more are yet to be discovered in the ocean because it is so vast and deep and difficult to explore. And 70% of the oxygen that we breathe comes from marine plants, produced by marine plants in the ocean. A bit more of the basics. The ocean absorbs 90% of the atmosphere's heat. It helps to distribute heat and nutrients around the globe. And this great ocean conveyor belt that I'm showing here, it moves warm and salty water up into the colder regions and mixes with cold, less salty water. And this whole circulation pattern and rotation of warm and cold waters throughout the globe influences the weather patterns that we have, the various climates of the different parts of the world, and the seasons. This is very important. And as I was making this presentation, I remembered that the best documentary I ever saw that described this large ocean conveyor belt in such a fantastic way was this recently put up documentary on Netflix called Our Oceans. It's actually narrated by Barack Obama. I just wanted to flag it. If you're interested in seeing a documentary that provides a lot of science background and explains ocean circulation in a really, really great way, I highly recommend. I just thought I would throw this in there. Okay, so now getting into sort of the human-ocean relationship. So 40% of the human population lives within 150 kilometers from the ocean. The human body is on average made of 60% water. And some may say that that's why babies or that's why people feel a connection to the ocean when they hear waves, and why it feels so calming to us is because when we were in the womb, we heard sounds very similar to that because we were born of water, and we have a lot of water in our bodies still. 15% of our protein comes from the ocean, fish, shellfish, etc. Many medicines come from the ocean, and actually pill capsules, a lot of them are made from kelp, so marine plants. Something interesting that I actually recently learned was that horseshoe crab blood is used to test vaccines for bacterial contamination. So without horseshoe blood, vaccines would potentially not exist or would not have gotten to the state that they are now. So we owe a lot to the ocean and what it provides for us. In addition to that, a lot of people understand the inherent value of the ocean and the natural world in general, in that it provides us with a sense of peace and calm, provides us with adventure and a sense of awe. These are all the reasons why I love the ocean very, very much. But there are many issues facing the ocean, largely due to human activities. The one that I focus mostly on in my day job, and that I'll speak about the most during this presentation, is climate change. There are many moving parts to climate change: warming, sea level rise, increased frequency and intensity of storms, which can cause coastal erosion, ocean acidification, so the decrease in pH, and deoxygenation. These are all caused by the same phenomenons, that they're caused by the increase of CO2 in our atmosphere. But all of these different impacts of climate change, they interact with one another, they feed off of one another, influence one another, and also result in cumulative impacts on marine life. There's also the problem of overfishing, fishing predatory species in particular, which can have widespread impacts on biodiversity, and pollution. So all three of these sort of big categories of impacts, they interact with one another, and they're all issues that scientists and activists are tackling continually. So I'll give a bit of background on climate change, the issue of climate change. This is a schematic that I made, I think during my master's thesis, to explain the background of a vulnerability assessment that I had developed. So climate change in the ocean, really, it starts with input of heat energy into the ocean and input of CO2, the heat energy because of the greenhouse effect. And as I mentioned before, the ocean absorbs 90% of the heat from our atmosphere. So that increased heat energy in a combination with reduced dissolution of oxygen, because warmer waters actually makes it harder for oxygen to be absorbed into the ocean. Combine that with algal blooms, because there's also increased nutrients in some areas due to runoff of fertilizer from agricultural lands, for example. So if there's any sort of algal bloom that then dies and sinks to the bottom, combined with reduced oxygen dissolution and warming, all of that can combine to create reduced oxygen in deeper areas, which can mean less oxygen for animals that live in those deeper areas. In addition to that, increased CO2 being absorbed into the ocean causes acidification. So that's a chemical reaction there where the water reacts with CO2 to reduce the amount of carbonate that's available in the ocean for animals to build their shells. Increased heat energy also in the ocean causes ice melt, which increases the input of fresh water from the melting of sea ice. And in some cases, that can increase the stratification of the ocean. So freshwater and saltwater. Freshwater is more buoyant, so it'll float on top and can create this sort of layering of the ocean, which can further reduce mixing of surface waters where there's more oxygen being absorbed from the atmosphere than there are in the deep. So if there's less mixing of oxygen-rich waters from the surface into the deep, that can further reduce oxygen availability to deep-dwelling organisms. What I study the most in the work that I've done is the increase in warming in the ocean. This can create changes in distribution of species, abundance of different populations. It influences the metabolism of particular animals, so how quickly they absorb the energy from their food and need to eat more, and therefore how quickly they grow, how much they reproduce, and how big they can grow over time. It also influences invasion of new species and can cause increased diseases. And so some species are moving out of areas where they previously existed. Other species are moving in, growing bigger, or their abundances are increasing. Other species that previously were not in particular regions are coming in. And actually, we see this a lot in Nova Scotia, where some tropical species are starting to be observed off of Nova Scotia, where they never were observed before. But then there's also invasive species that can cause issues for things like aquaculture. So there's an issue in Nova Scotia or most of the Eastern Canada where these tunicates are growing on top of mussels that are being farmed and smothering them. So this can be a huge issue for human industries. So globally, what we're seeing as a result of warming is, in general, a lot of species are moving away from the equator and moving towards the poles and seeking out cooler waters. So this results in a lot of shifting of ecosystem structures. So some species are moving in, other species are moving out at different rates. And this means that the community structure is different, the biodiversity is different. And like I said, it can have negative impacts like invasive species, tunicates growing on mussel farms, or it can just be a change that is neutral. It's neither good nor bad. And so that's sort of the stance that I've taken in a lot of discussions around how climate change is potentially impacting things like biodiversity. If we keep the ecosystem healthy through change, then it's a healthy ecosystem with different species. But if we can maintain that biodiversity with those different species, then it's not a negative thing. It's just change. But the idea is to keep the ecosystems healthy. Other changes, I'm sure you've heard about coral bleaching. And as I said, that's actually the first insight into the ocean and changes in the ocean that led me down the path of marine biology, or seeking a career in marine biology. Coral bleaching is the result of the oceans becoming too warm for the algae that live on the corals. And there's a symbiotic relationship between the algae and the coral. The algae feeds the coral. And so when those algae die, and it's actually the algae that gives the coral its color, you're left with a coral that is white in color, or bleached. Other strange things that are happening as a result of warming are that sea turtles, oops, didn't realize it was a video. I forgot that it was a video. I used to work on a sea turtle conservation project, and this is actually a video that I took of the babies that we released on the beach in the early morning. So typically in a less warm environment, baby turtles will be a mix of male and female, but in a lot of areas where it's warming really rapidly, we end up with more females than males. And this can influence the sort of reproductive ability of a population where there's not enough males to be with the females and create new turtles. And it's an issue not only for the ecosystems themselves, but for the humans that depend on them. Some issues that we're facing, we see it in the news, increased severity and frequency of storms, which can cause flooding. Also drought that can cause wildfires, and we've definitely been seeing that recently. And this accumulates with things like pollution. So pollution, which can mean outflow of toxic or nutrient dense things from human areas, human populations, agriculture, which can but it can also mean plastic pollution, which drives species out of their homes. It can kill animals or damage their health. It can enter food chains. Particularly, I'm sure you've heard about microplastics finding their way into human bodies as a result of them being ingested by animals, and then humans eating those animals, causing reductions in oxygen concentrations and or toxicity due to increased nutrient inputs or toxic algal blooms or toxic outflows. And I'm sure you've seen a lot of these images of what plastic pollution can do to marine life. Another issue, as I mentioned, is overfishing, and particularly fishing out predators. So fishing out those large-bodied organisms in the ocean, which can have really big impacts on biodiversity. This is something that I studied in my PhD thesis, actually. So this overfishing can lead to the extinction of some species, reduced population size or health of a population. So it reduces, if you reduce a population to a small number of individuals, you reduce their ability to adapt to changing environmental conditions. So the larger a population is, the more able they might be to evolve and adapt to changing conditions or shift in distribution. But if you've reduced the population size, they're less able to adapt. Reduced body size of predators. So if we're fishing only large-bodied species, then you're left with the small ones. Reduced functional diversity. So again, if we're fishing out all the predators, then the species at the bottom of the food chain will increase because they're not being eaten. And that can have wide impacts on ecosystem structure and function. Reduce the amount and quality of food available for humans. So if we're fishing out all the things that we like to fish and they become extinct, or they reduce in body size, or their population size decreases, that means less for us to enjoy in the future and for future generations. So what all is being done about this? And I'm going to try to get a bit more positive as the presentation goes on. I know that the negative aspects of things that are changing can be a bit daunting and a bit can get you a bit downhearted sometimes, but there are things being done, and there are ways that we can conquer all of this and turn it around. So emissions reduction plans are in place. We've got green energy transitions happening, habitat restoration, including restoration of blue carbon habitats. So these are areas like salt marshes and seagrass meadows and kelp forests. If we can increase the green plants that live in the ocean, that means we can increase the CO2 absorption from the atmosphere and burial through their root systems into the sediments, as well as increasing oxygen because plants produce oxygen. Species at risk recovery planning. So a lot of the damage that's been done to species that are endangered or threatened, we have recovery plans in place to try to help these populations increase and get back to their previous abundances. Sustainable fisheries management, ecosystem-based management. So there are really fantastic scientists working to figure out how we can sustainably manage our fisheries so we don't end up overfishing. And what does that mean for quotas, how many we should fish, and how the different species interact with one another, and also limits on body size, those sorts of things. Co-management of protected areas and other conservation areas with Indigenous communities and organizations who have a more holistic way of thinking about our relationship with nature and how to ensure that these natural areas can be sustained for future generations, and how to have a positive relationship with nature. So we've seen more and more of these types of co-management systems being put in place, particularly in the Arctic and Pacific. And so that's fantastic. Policies to reduce plastic use and consumption, and climate change adaptation planning in government and local communities. And this is the type of work that I have been working on in my academic career. Myself and many others do research to support decisions on where, when, and how adaptation to climate change is needed. And so now diving a little bit into the science that's being done to support our understanding of climate change and to also help guide the actions that are needed to adapt to how things are changing. And as I mentioned before, to maintain biodiversity, to maintain ecosystem health, even as things are changing. And so there are many moving parts that many different people are working on with different expertise. And these are just some of them, but the basics of sort of climate change science are the climate change scenarios. So that is from the International Panel on Climate Change. Global groups of climate change scientists look at social patterns and emissions, and look at how different future scenarios of how the population changes, how economic development occurs in different countries, and how we reduce or do not reduce our emissions over time, but on a global scale, global average, and what that could mean for multiple future climate scenarios. And then the ocean climate models that come from those scenarios or use those scenarios, they predict how the ocean will change as a result. And so there are multiple scenarios of warming in the ocean, as an example. And then biologists use those ocean climate models of how the environment is predicted to change to predict how species will react. So there are species distribution models which predict where species will move, because different species have different ranges of temperatures that they prefer. So right now they exist in temperatures that they prefer, but in the future they might not be in this particular area anymore. They might shift to another area in seeking out temperatures that they tolerate. And then at a different level, there are risk assessments and vulnerability assessments that look at, in a particular area, what is the risk imposed by climate change on the health distribution of a species or stock. And what does that mean for the communities, the industries of that particular area? And then there are decision supports. So there are people thinking more, more on a social science side of things, using the species distribution models, the risk assessments, vulnerability assessments to say, what does this information mean for decision makers, for managers? How can they use this information to change the way that they're managing the systems that they're managing? What does risk mean to a fisheries manager, a conservation person? What does a high risk mean, and what do they do about it? And so that's more on the social science side. And then there's also other ways of knowing. So acknowledging that Western science is not the be all and end all. In fact, there are communities of people who have been stewarding natural ecosystems since time immemorial, and they know how we should be interacting in a way that supports human and nature holistically. So connecting the dots, connecting the Western science and the information and the data that we can provide with other ways of knowing as well. So I thought I would give some examples of the science that I've personally been involved in that supports our understanding and preparedness for climate change in Canada's oceans and freshwater habitats. So going way back, I've been sort of in the climate change science game for quite some time. This was when I was doing my honors thesis at Dalhousie University and met Nancy Shackle, who's been my longtime mentor and my supervisor throughout a lot of my graduate studies. And we developed a species distribution model. And at the time, climate change projections. So when I listed sort of the moving parts of climate change science and how we take the future climate scenarios and develop ocean climate models, at this time, there weren't any ocean climate models available for us to have really fine scale information about how temperature was going to change in this area versus that area over in a smaller region. We had a general assumption that temperatures would increase on average by 1, 2, or 3 degrees. So we had a blanket simplified projection of warming of, okay, if temperature increases on average by this much, what would that mean for species distributions in the area? How much habitat would they lose, or thermal habitat? And so we identified species that seemed to be more vulnerable because they're predicted to lose a lot more habitat than others in Canadian, Eastern Canadian waters. And this triggered us to inform species management and also to develop a vulnerability assessment, which I'll get into on the next slide. But we also developed vulnerability assessments for the Gulf of St. Lawrence, species distribution models for the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And predicted based on, again, really simplified projections of warming, like a warming of 3 degrees, and also predictions of how dissolved oxygen would decrease in deeper waters, how that would impact the distribution of 3 commercially important species. And then we found out years later, based on anecdotal sort of reports in the news from fishing communities, that our predictions were potentially very correct, that we had predicted that Atlantic cod would actually increase off the southwestern coast of Newfoundland, and at the time there was an increase a little bit after this paper was published. So that's how these sorts of tools can really help us predict and prepare for what changes are ahead. So these species distribution models led us to develop a vulnerability assessment. This was actually the first vulnerability assessment in Canada for marine species. And the idea was, we know that species are going to shift in distribution, but as I mentioned previously in this presentation, other impacts can increase or decrease the sensitivity of a species to environmental change. So if a species is already overfished and has a low population, it's going to respond potentially more strongly to to a change in environmental conditions. It'll be more stressed because it can't adapt as easily, and its population is not strong enough to withstand additional stress. So knowing that there are other things that influence species sensitivity or adaptive capacity to climate change, we developed a vulnerability assessment that not only considered distribution shifts and loss of thermal habitat, but also these other factors, and then ranked species off of Nova Scotia by their vulnerability. And then we use that information to inform fisheries managers and conservation managers in the region. But then in recent years, there's been an update to that vulnerability assessment, and it's called the Climate Risk Index for Biodiversity. It's at a global scale. So ours was just for off of Nova Scotia. Now there's a vulnerability assessment for the entire global ocean that evaluates very similar indices of vulnerability to climate change, and uses, unlike the early versions of these vulnerability assessments, mine included, unlike using sort of a blanket increase of 2 or 3 degrees, this vulnerability assessment uses ocean climate models that are now available that predict how the environment is going to change or how much it's going to warm at a very fine spatial scale. And that's what's indicated there by those grid lines. So within a very small grid cell, how the things could be changing differently from the grid cell next to it. And these ocean climate models give us that fine scale view of how things will change. And then combine that with information about how the species is doing in that small grid cell. So yeah, since I've started in this field, things have advanced a lot, and it's really great. We're making progress. We're developing data sets that are spatial in nature, and we can visualize how things are going to change, and what that means for the species that we care about in the areas that we're interested in. And so most recently, myself and some colleagues used that climate risk index to look at how species, there's actually one index within that vulnerability assessment which predicts the year in which we expect a species will no longer tolerate the temperatures in a particular grid cell. So we looked at all the ecologically important conservation priority species within the Gulf of the Scotian Shelf Bay of Fundy bioregion, so off of Nova Scotia. And we overlaid them with the marine protected areas that are currently existing in that region, and said, which of these species will no longer exist within the boundaries of those marine protected areas or other conservation areas by the year 2025, 2050, 2075, 2100. And we grouped them based on their characteristics there. So you can see benthic fish, pelagic fish, cetaceans, and reptiles. And the two panels here that you're seeing, RCP 2.6 and RCP 8.5, those are two different emission scenarios. So that different climate future based on how much we're emitting or not emitting. So RCP 2.5 is our best case scenario. So that is if we significantly reduce our emissions on a global scale. RCP 8.5 is if globally our emissions continue to increase. It's the status quo emission scenario. So looking at different futures, what does that look like for the species that are of interest? And when do we predict that they will move out of an area that may or may not have been designed to protect that species? And what does that mean for conservation managers? And then we took the climate risk index data for all of Canada, and we overlaid our marine protected areas and other conservation areas and looked at how vulnerable the different marine protected areas are in the different regions, and whether marine protected areas are being placed in a full range of vulnerabilities. So are we protecting areas that are changing rapidly, or areas that are not changing very much at all? Or are we protecting the full range of vulnerabilities from slow change to rapid change? So with the assumption that we should be protecting areas that are changing slowly and rapidly, so that we're protecting both the current ecosystems that need protection as they change more slowly, but then also those future ecosystems that are going to develop in ways that we don't know, we don't expect, and could potentially be very biodiverse areas in the future with different species assemblages than we have now. So we found that in areas where marine protected areas were designed to protect multiple habitat types and like a very wide range of different habitats, it actually inherently protected areas with different climate change vulnerabilities. So having a diversity of habitat to protect different species assemblages actually had it was like a proxy for being climate resilient. So that led us to suggest that habitat representativity should be a feature of designing marine protected areas, because it can protect, future and present day ecosystems. I think I'll skip over that, but if you want more details on this, I can provide it. And then into the freshwater habitat project. So this has been going on since 2021, January of 2021. So I developed another vulnerability assessment. I've been doing this since 2012, but this one was for freshwater. So using the climate risk index for biodiversity that was previously developed for marine ecosystems, I looked at all the different indices that were included in that and adjusted them to be specific for freshwater. And then I used that to assess the vulnerability of different species in rivers and lakes throughout Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and New Brunswick. And here's just an example of what that looks like for Atlantic salmon, and how you can look at different watersheds and how some watersheds are more vulnerable than others for a particular species of interest, and what that means in terms of risk. And I'm also giving an example here of the time of emergence. So like that Lewis paper that I previously mentioned, where we looked at the year in which we predict a species to no longer exist in an area because it becomes too warm. So now this is showing that particular index laid out in map format for Atlantic salmon. So the year in which we predict Atlantic salmon will no longer be present in a particular watershed. That's just one of the indices that is now available. And the hope is that this will inform recovery efforts for Atlantic salmon, recreational fishing, and the hope is that we can expand this work to different areas. Okay, so that's a little bit about the science that's being done. The science that's being done to tackle the issue of climate change and the cumulative impacts with other stressors like overfishing. But I know that this can all seem a little bit daunting. And I want to take a step back, because it's not just if you're not a scientist, I know it can feel a bit stressful to hear that all these changes are happening and it feels like it might be out of your hands. So I want to now kind of shift gears and talk about what everyone can do with the tools that we have at hand. And again, these are AI generated images. So yeah, I want to change it to talk a bit more positively and bring it back to community and bring it back to individual actions. And yes, you can decide to take on a career that does the science needed to understand the problems and how to fix them, like I have. But you can also do policy work, consulting, or advocacy work. Like many of you, I know that there's a climate action aspect to Soo Climate Hub, and like that is fantastic and so needed. So that's the putting the pressure on to put the solutions in place. Become a storyteller, science communication, journalism, filmmaking. I mentioned a documentary that I found was fantastic, and I really think that translating science or communicating science in a way that more people can understand makes it seem less daunting. It gives you the tools and the understanding that you need to understand the complexities of the issue and how it is real, but also how it can be fixed. I think that's very important to increase understanding on a population level. include a sustainability, ethics, or environmental lens to whatever work you do. I think that there's a role that anyone can play in this, tackling these issues, and I think that it can be done in multiple levels in your day-to-day life, in your conversations, and you can also get involved, do research to eat as sustainably as possible within your means and geography. Be a conscious consumer, so buy less, recycle, compost, reuse, repurpose, repair. Also, something that I find really helpful is to get your hands dirty. I love gardening, and I love feeling like I have a bit of control over some of the foods that I eat by growing them myself. But also it helps me connect with community. So being part of like a community garden is really helpful for me personally, and helps me to connect with the earth. And yeah, so all the ways that you can build your own relationship with earth, we protect what we love, and we can influence others to love what we love. There's also some resources that I could share in the chat later, if you're interested. There are reports going out of the Canadian government that provide more information on how the ocean is changing, and the science that's being done to monitor it, to prepare for the changes that are happening. And then there's tools like the Canadian Extreme Water Level Adaptation Tool. It's publicly available, and it gives you an idea of how the water level is changing in different areas. And so again, that can help us prepare for what's to come in terms of infrastructure, coastal erosion. So everyone's path and calling is different, but equally important. I think we all have a part to play, and we've all gotten to where we are through different paths. And I know we all care and all have very valuable skills and passions to bring to the table. And so I wanted to leave off on that note. So thank you so much for listening. And I guess I'm here for questions.
Oh, Christine, this will take a while to digest. How brilliant. And I'm so heartened by the conclusion that we all still can make a difference. And I think, excuse me, that's the message that for me anyway, we're seeking. This is really off the wall, but I'm curious, have you discovered that people who live by the ocean are more sensitive to trying to connect and do something than people, say, in the interior? Or
I think that everyone is connected to the environment that they're closest to. So, I mean, I think that growing up both, and I always have a water perspective.
yeah,
I'm sure that
sure.
there are people who feel very connected to forests and mountains, and I maybe feel less so that way. I'm more of a water person. So I know that it depends on where you are, and that you feel more connected to what you understand, what you see, what you're a part of. So yeah, I think maybe when you live on the ocean, you feel more connected to the ocean. You see the impacts directly, and people in your community are fishermen, and so you know more about the issues like firsthand. So perhaps, but I think I see changes happening everywhere. I think that large cities seem to fall behind a lot more. The small towns that I've been to, a lot of them, and when I lived in Halifax, it's a small city, and I was so impressed by the waste management system that they had. It seems they're so conscious of our waste and making sure that it's processed properly. And like waste sorting was a big thing. And if you didn't sort properly, they would not take your garbage, and you'd have to try again. And you were only allowed one garbage bag, and the rest had to be recycling or compost, one garbage bag per week. And then I moved to Montreal, and we have none of that. and there's no control over the garbage. There's no limits. There's no stickers to say no, you didn't do it properly. Try again. I think that it's a management thing. When there's more people, it seems more daunting, and I guess it's just more difficult to manage and get those like whole of society actions. Yeah, I guess I don't know if that answers your question, but I
Really a fair question, I think. As I said, I'm so uplifted by well, first of all, the melding of science and reality, and then inspiring people to act. So I was just curious if the ocean has called you, but I was wondering if more people near the ocean had been more galvanized to do that action. But I think the fact that you've identified that people identify with their home
Mhm.
environment makes a lot of sense. But I'm seeing things jumping up on the chat, so I'm going to see if I can um, so I'll just read them in order and take them wherever you like. You can see them as well. Can you, Christine?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Okay, so then the first one is, can we help with acidification by dumping eggshells, like from egg McMuffins, into the ocean to help shellfish?
So the dumping eggshells idea, the egg McMuffin detail is funny, but dumping eggshells is actually similar to what things that are actually happening in some coastal areas. So there are efforts underway by some private science organizations to try out alkalinity or alkalinization of the water. So putting lime and other sort of natural compounds in the water to increase the pH, to reduce acidification. It's still in the testing phase in a lot of areas. So this is like a new science, something that's newly being tried out. And it also, there's a lot of science is needed to find out if it's safe. So if you do influence the environment in this drastic way, will it have any negative impacts? So we have positive intentions, but we need to make sure that it's not going to cause changes that we might have not anticipated or not planned, not hoped for. So right now, there's a lot of science that needs to happen. And I think a lot of people are trying to figure out how to get that science to happen. You know, it requires funding, it requires direction, and who should do it is still sort of a decision that needs to be made. But I know that that is happening. So yeah, it's similar to like eggshells. It's the compounds that are in eggshells, and putting that into the ocean and seeing if that can help with the acidification problem. Yeah.
Cool. I'm not sure about the Repair Cafe. I think that's an announcement. Question about the strange thing that was affecting the cultivation of oysters' mussels. Heard you say it was a tunicate. What actually is it? It looks like a
Yeah.
calcification on the shellfish.
It does kind of look like that, but it's a tunicate. So if you've heard of sea squirts, it's like a tunicate is a sea squirt. They're these tubular organisms that they're kind of, yeah, they're like tubes, and there's a lot of them are see-through, but they can be various colors. So it's an animal, and it feeds by filtering the water. And so these tunicate species are moving into the area because the water is becoming warm enough that it's tolerable for them, and they're coming in at a rate that is really high. And so they need somewhere. These animals, they're sedentary, they attach to things, and they attach to rocks, they attach to the edges of docks, and so they're attaching to these hanging, floating mounds of mussels. And unfortunately, the mussels, they also filter water to feed and also to get oxygen onto their into their bodies. And when these tunicates attach to them, it smothers them and they can't open their shell to be able to filter water and get the food and the oxygen that they need. Yeah, so that's what it is.
Now I assume because it's, well, I guess you could argue that it's invasive, but maybe so is farming of the ocean. Yeah, okay. So that helps a lot to understand what that is and why it is a problem.
Yeah.
But the only solution then is prevent it from happening or to somehow eradicate them, which is bringing another whole host of problems, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I think that the last I heard, they were trying to spray them off with water jets and just continually clean them, because there's really you can't make the water less warm. You can't make it less tolerable for tunicates. That would potentially injure the other animals that you don't want to harm. So it's definitely a tricky one. And I think it's really a management thing. Like, we need to figure out how to do our farming in a way that prevents the negative impacts of the tunicates and just accept that they're there and they're coming in. It's been a while since I've gotten an update on how that's going and whether it's still a major issue or if they've found ways to prevent the negative impacts. So, but I'm sure that they have by now, because there's still a lot of really successful aquaculture happening out east for mussels and oysters. So they must have figured out ways to prevent it from negatively impacting their stocks. And on the topic of shellfish, it's definitely something that we are doing that is outside the natural realm, but shellfish filter the water. So in a lot of ways, it is a cleaner thing to be farming, because they're actually filtering the water, as opposed to creating, like fish, creating waste in the water. And there's been proposals for multi-species aquaculture sites where they've got fish on top of the shellfish, and then the shellfish are feeding off of I know it sounds a little gross, but they feed off the waste of the fish and clean the water, and then you don't have the issue of increased waste in the water from the fish that you're farming, and then you're feeding the shellfish.
Yeah, that's sort of the way people keep their own aquariums, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Cool. This one, thanks for the great presentation. For the many different marine organisms, do we actually know how much they can adapt internally rather than just moving? So I guess it's
yeah.
What's the word I want? Yeah.
So there are slight variations in genetics between different populations. And actually, there's this very cool program happening out of Newfoundland and Nova Scotia called GenArc. And they are testing the differences in genetics of different populations to see which ones are more adaptable within the same species. So one species, but different populations. Some populations are more adaptable to changing environment or tolerate higher temperatures than another population. And so we know that there are animals that might be the same species, but because they've been in a particular area that's different from other individuals of their same species, they've adapted differently to that area, and they've produced different genetics as a result. So that's definitely possible. And we know that some species, they reproduce more quickly. They live shorter lives, but then they reproduce and create the new generation really quickly. So generations turn over, and because of that, they can evolve really fast. Whereas a species that lives for longer and reproduces less, they'd have to, like the individual would have to adapt, as opposed to them evolving through generations. And they could evolve, but much more slowly because the generation time is longer. So yeah, that's, and there are species that are also just inherently more adaptable to rapid changes in environmental conditions. They're just hardier species. And that's actually one of the indices of the vulnerability assessment that we have. It's based on where the species has lived in over the past 15 years. How much does the environment, how much has the environment fluctuated during that time while the species has lived there? So then we can, if it's fluctuated a lot, we can kind of infer that it must be adapted to rapid environmental change. So maybe it would be less vulnerable to further change. So, yeah.
Cool. This is a great question. Is there a seafood we should avoid as consumers to help ocean preservation?
That's a good question. It's a tricky one. There are international fisheries that are less, there are some international fisheries that are less sustainable than, say, fisheries that are regulated by the Canadian government, but it's hard to tell which ones those are. There is the Marine Stewardship Council. It's a logo that you can find on some food. There's other logos. So if you check the packaging and you see logos, that can be an indication that it's more sustainable. But sometimes it's hard for these organizations that are putting the stickers. It's hard for them to know for sure that they have all the right information. That the boat that they're saying that the fish came from is in fact the boat that the fish came from, and that the boat went to the location that they said they went to. So it's hard. There are, in Canada, there are fisheries that we do know are the abundance is, or the population is doing really well. The fishery is managed really well, and so we can feel comfortable that we're fishing well, and we can eat that fish and feel good about it. And you can kind of read about it in the news. You can read about it on the government website. Like we're actually, Canada's really good at documenting what we're doing and how we're managing things. Internationally, yeah, it's tough. It's tough. There is a website, and I wish I had written it down before I joined this call, but there's Sea-Watch, I think. I'll have to, maybe you must have an email list, right, Carmen? Like if I provided you with some resources, some links, could I give it to you and you could send it to your email list?
Sure. Yeah.
There's a website where they've ranked global fisheries and species by their sustainability. And there's a card that gives you like red, yellow, green of the fish that you're eating. And so that's really helpful. So I can, once I remember the name, I think it's Sea-Watch or something, I can send it to you.
Cool. Thank you. And that is just so critical, I think. Yeah. Considering tourists loving the coral reefs to death, does education in these hotspots help at all about reef-friendly sunscreen and feed off, or do we need to close areas off not to allow people to access the coral? These vulnerable spaces, how do we help these localities do the right thing when there is no rules or restrictions and the people depend on tourists? I'm thinking about a place I love. I don't know how to say it, Roatan, off the coast of Honduras. It is so sad to see the damage inflicted by tourism in the short time I've been going there.
Yeah, it's tough. And also I'm sure some of the damage is due to warming as well. But in terms of sunscreen and damage by kicking and those sorts of things, it's really up to the government of the place, the government of the country that's regulating its own exclusive economic zone in the ocean, and also the businesses that are running them. So the businesses are regulated by their own government, and they have control over what they do. I think that we probably have power as individuals to speak up if we see something that we know is wrong or damaging, to speak up, to say something, to make people aware. So perhaps the people that are running a particular business are not aware that they should be informing people ahead of time that this is not allowed, or reiterating that, or giving instructions before people show up to make sure that they don't wear sunscreen that's not reef safe, or to provide the reef safe sunscreen for purchase. Or like I think there's things that could be suggested. And I think just speaking up to people around you that, oh, this is really damaging, and I think that we shouldn't be doing that. Sometimes it can feel awkward to be the person who brings these things up, but I think more people that bring it up, the more it becomes commonplace, and then it's not awkward anymore because people are hearing it multiple times from different people. And I think that as tourists, that's kind of the only power that we have, because we can't control other governments, we can't control companies, but we can be people that have opinions and can kind of spread the word.
I've lived through the cod moratorium. Cod fisheries are reopened. Was the extreme action considered successful? And I assume this extreme action is the moratorium.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a tricky one. Again. So there was a cod moratorium. There were other groundfish fisheries that were still occurring while the groundfish moratorium was underway. And some of those groundfish fisheries had cod bycatch. That is potentially one of the reasons why the cod took a really long time to recover, or didn't recover in some areas. In some, they have recovered in some areas, certainly. We did fish a lot of the large-bodied individuals, so there was a change in the size structure of the population, and in some areas that's recovered, in other areas not. There's many different reasons why, and scientists have studied this. There's a lot of papers trying to figure out why things have not recovered very quickly in some areas, and other areas, yes, they have. So yeah, that's definitely a tricky question. I think it's place-based, and I think that management of fisheries is one tool that we have, but there are multiple factors at play, and we can't control them all. Things that I know that bycatch is certainly something that, again, scientists are working on and trying to figure out where and how that might be an issue, and if so, what to do about it. I know that there's ways that have been developed to reduce bycatch in a lot of areas. So that's a positive change that's happened at sort of the industry level. And so in the areas where cod fisheries have opened, and they haven't reopened everywhere, I think that is a positive story, because they've reopened because the population has rebounded. So yeah, I think that's a tough one, though, and that's a contentious issue. And I think that, yeah, that's definitely a contentious issue, and it continues to be. So
yeah. I see no more questions. Can I invite anyone to add a question? We are a bit over time, I realize. Not that I'm worried. Looks like everybody's good. Oh my, I've been looking so forward to this evening, and I have not. It's just been so awesome. I learned so much from you this evening, and I want to say thank you for your passion, for your voice, for the ocean, and showing how we have a role in caring. So can't thank you enough.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you all for your advocacy and for the work that you do. I think it's so, so important. And like I said, making it more commonplace. The more of us that are speaking about these things and talking about these things and learning about these things, the better. It widens the scope of our reach. So thank you. Thank you for what you do.
I would like to say thank you to all who have attended this and our other Climate Hub webinars. The Sioux Climate Hub has a voice because of the support of all of you. And today, the need for those passionate voices, as Christine just said, is greater than ever. As a network of like-minded citizens, we appreciate your ideas. We depend on you for making and completing events and activities. And above all, we value your continued support in building awareness of the climate crisis and other environmental issues, of course. So I will now end this wonderful evening with an invitation to all to join us for our next Sioux Climate Hub webinar presented by, and I believe it's Joni McGuffin of the Lake Superior Nature Conservancy. That is not confirmed, but I believe that is going to be at the end of April, the last week, the last Wednesday of April. So again, thank you. Everyone have an enlightened evening and walk forward.